First of all, good afternoon and welcome everyone. My name is Fiona Greenhalgh and I am a Programme Officer and Project Coordinator at the EATG. So I'm really happy to be opening this virtual roundtable on why people living with HIV must be included in non-HIV clinical trials. Today we have many aims for our time together. Firstly, we want to engage stakeholders from the HIV field to present the position paper developed by EATG. We want to raise awareness on the necessity to include people living with HIV in clinical research of potentially life-extending or life-saving drugs and treatments for other health conditions and comorbidities. We want to start developing partnerships, including identifying key actors to involve in this process. At the end of the webinar, we also want to present the overall aim for EATG's Belong project and the next steps for moving forward from the publication of our position paper. So before we get started, we do have some rules and reminders. First of all, the roundtable is being recorded. So by participating in this meeting, you're already consenting to being recorded and for this recording to be made public to the participants and to the general public. We do encourage you to send questions at any time through the chat function, which you can use the icon at the bottom of your screen to find that. And the questions will be addressed during the panel discussion and throughout the roundtable session. We kindly ask all participants to please stay muted and with your camera off when you're not speaking. If you want to ask a question orally, please just raise your hand using that function at the bottom of the screen and we will come to you for your question. So I now want to hand over to Roger Tatoud, who will give an overview of the EATG position paper on why people living with HIV must be included in non-HIV clinical trials.
Thank you, Fiona. Welcome all. It is a pleasure to welcome everybody on this call today. And in the next 10 minutes, I will provide an overview of the EATG position paper that was published in September 22 on why people living with HIV must be included in non-HIV clinical trial. My name is Roger Tatoud, and I'm a global health consultant supporting the work of the EATG. Next, please. So nowadays, when people living with HIV have been diagnosed early enough and are able to access treatment, they are living longer and healthy life. However, they are developing illnesses associated with aging, as seen in the general population. These illnesses can differ from those observed in the general population, as you can see on the graph on the left. In particular, there are higher rates of cancer, respiratory disease, liver and kidney disease, but also neurocognitive disorder and mental health-related condition. And this recent presentation at BIVA, the conference in the UK, showed an accelerated aging of the brain in people living with HIV caused by a number of factors. At the same time, people living with HIV are still marginalized in a number of countries and settings due to stigma and discrimination, which affect their access to healthcare. In addition, they do not always have access to the best healthcare available because they have not been included in clinical trials conducted to develop treatment for this condition, and therefore their efficacy and safety are not known. And the reason for that is that people living with HIV are being excluded, often arbitrarily and solely on the basis of their serostatus, from studies that are not related to HIV. Next, please. For example, this slide shows the level of inclusion of people living with HIV in studies assessing immune checkpoint inhibitors, which are drugs developed for the treatment of a number of cancers. As you can quickly see by just looking at the size of the black bar on the graph on the left, which shows the number of studies excluding people living with HIV, they are largely excluded from studies conducted for the development of treatment for a range of cancer. And this is happening at all stages of clinical research, and that's the bottom part of the graph. Studies sponsored and researchers are often concerned that in this case, immune checkpoint inhibitor could reactivate viral replication, or that they could be toxic or not efficacious in this population. Some of these concerns may be valid, but it is difficult to know for sure without conducting proper studies. At the same time, there are a number of limited studies that have shown that immune checkpoint inhibitors were safe and efficacious in people living with HIV receiving treatment, and that the results of these studies were largely similar to that of studies excluding people living with HIV. Of course, inclusion of patients living with HIV requires monitoring and taking into account a number of factors related to their status. Next, please. There has been quite a lot of work done on this, especially in the US, and that has led the US Food and Drug Administration, working in collaboration with cancer patients and with research organizations, to produce a clinical trial guideline defining eligibility criteria for the safe participation of people living with HIV, Hep B and C in cancer studies. This guideline builds on two aspects. One being an evaluation of the immune functions of people living with HIV, and the other, the status and stage of the HIV therapy. Next. So, back. Sorry. For the immune function, CD4 count is an important eligibility criteria. The guideline recommends that the threshold for inclusion is a CD4 count about 350 cells per microliter. Importantly, the history of AIDS-defining opportunistic infection also needs to be taken into account. Patients who have no history of AIDS-defining opportunistic infection should generally be eligible. For those who have a history of AIDS-defining opportunistic infection, then the time and type of infection and the type of cancer, as well as the curative potential of the intervention, should be considered. Finally, it is important to assess potential drug-drug interaction when they are known. Next. Regarding HIV therapy, timing of the diagnosis of HIV acquisition, initiation of ART, viral load before enrollment should be considered. Here again, drug-drug interaction should be taken into account, as well as the potential for overlapping toxicities. But when there are potential interaction, switching to a different treatment for HIV for the duration of a clinical trial could be considered as an option. An important aspect in all cases is to assess the potential impact of the non-HIV intervention on HIV. Overall, these guidelines demonstrate that it is possible to reach a consensus on eligibility criteria for the safe inclusion of people living with HIV in non-HIV trial. Now, with or without a guideline, can the recruitment of people living with HIV in non-HIV trial be improved through an advocacy effort? Next, please. This is what the Cancer Therapy Evaluation Program Advocacy, an NIH initiative that promotes the inclusion of people living with HIV in non-HIV trial, set up to do and evaluated between January 2014 and May 2019. As you can see from this table, the inclusion of people living with HIV was evaluated in 87 studies of immune checkpoint inhibitors, drugs developed for cancer treatment, at the letter of intent stage or at the final protocol stage. Through their advocacy effort, the number of studies including people with HIV greatly increased from letter of intent to final protocol. This happened at various clinical phases of research and for a number of anti-cancer agents tested, and demonstrate again that it is possible to include people living with HIV in non-HIV clinical trial. Next. Altogether, this led the EATG, which focused its activities on the European region, to a call to action. An important limitation to increasing the participation of people living with HIV in non-HIV trial is the limited amount of data available on their current inclusion in non-HIV trial and on the safety of conducting trial in this population. In that regard, the US has developed a tool which is called the Drug Trial Snapshot, which captures the level of inclusion of diverse population in clinical trials. The tool does not specifically look at people living with HIV, but it is something that could be incorporated and adapted to gather further data. It is important to note that existing clinical research guidelines recommend and encourage an appropriate representation of different groups and populations in clinical research. These guidelines can already be used to support increasing the participation of people living with HIV in non-HIV trial. In addition, specific guidance would also be needed. Such guidance will need to be specific to health conditions that disproportionately or specifically affect people living with HIV. There is also a need to further our understanding of drugs interaction, and the regulator should be encouraged to request sponsors to provide a clear rationale or the exclusion of people living with HIV from a particular study. This is in line with general ethics principle of research that states that the research should benefit the populations that are affected by a disease. This advocacy work can contribute to emphasize the importance of diversity in clinical research, and as such, it should be extended to transgender people and women living with HIV. Next. Looking forward, it will be important to engage broadly with all those involved in research and development, and this includes people living with HIV, communities of patients, the pharmaceutical industry, and the regulator. Gathering more data will support a global effort to raise awareness of the issue, and the engagement process will need to be a meaningful one. There are already a number of resources available, and existing guidelines can provide a starting point. Next. In conclusion, I would like to refer you to the position paper that contains more information and end with a few key messages. People living with HIV can contribute to non-HIV clinical research. They should not be arbitrarily excluded from life-saving research. Regulators should support and contribute to the development of consensus guidelines that ensure the safe participation of people living with HIV in non-HIV trials. Meaningful engagement of people living with HIV in clinical research is essential to establish a strong and trustworthy relationship between patients, researchers, and healthcare providers. It also ensures that the voice of people living with HIV are heard throughout the research process, that their needs are met. Ultimately, advocating for the participation of people living with HIV in non-HIV trials contribute to global patient empowerment and the democratization of the research process. Thank you very much. Over to you, Fiona.
Thank you so much. I have posted the link to the position paper in the chat so everyone can have a read of that in full. So now we're going to move on to the panel session. So I'm just going to take a bit of time to introduce our panel speakers here. Thank you so much for joining. And after that, we'll get into our questions and have a roundtable discussion. We do have over 50 people here today joining, so you're also part of this roundtable, part of the discussion. And like we said, please do ask questions and make comments and join in. So first of all, I want to introduce Jim Pickett. Jim Pickett is a long-time HIV prevention research advocate and a senior advisor to AVAC since 2022. He has been living with HIV since 1995, and he's been working in the field ever since. Pause magazine has referred to him as a soldier instrumental in fighting for much needed new prevention methods, undeterred by subjects many would prefer to ignore. He was inducted into Chicago's Gay and Lesbian Hall of Fame in 2005 and is married to his best friend. Next, I want to introduce Daniela Rojas Castro. She is the director of the Community Research and Strategic Information Department at Coalition Plus and holds a PhD in social psychology and methodology. With 20 years of research experience, she has participated in international HIV research projects and is the author of numerous scientific publications and other works. She is also principal investigator and co-principal investigator for numerous other projects. She's a member of many organizations and committees such as EATG, the International Scientific Committee of the AIDS Impact Conference, and the Eurotest platform. And last but not least, Christopher Mann, who has completed a PhD in advanced therapies and 2 postdoctorates in gene therapy, immunology, and skeletal muscle regeneration. Since 2012, Christopher has been working for Asphalion, which is an international scientific and regulatory affairs company based in Barcelona, where he's currently one of the scientific and regulatory affairs director with a specialization in biological products, including advanced therapies, vaccines, and new technologies. He's worked on several projects over the years relating to persons living with HIV, including different vaccine technology and several clinical trials. So I'm passing back to Roger.
Thank you, Fiona, and welcome to our panelists. Just making sure you are all on screen and I can see you. As noted in the introduction by Fiona, the position paper is really the starting point of a number of activities that focus on the European region. we are somehow lucky that the US is at a more advanced stage. I've already developed a guideline, although it focuses on cancer trial, but there probably is much to learn from their effort. And my first question will be to Jim, who has been very active in the HIV prevention community. And clearly, as I noted in one of my key messages, we need a meaningful engagement between a number of very diverse stakeholders. And that's a situation, I guess, and I know you have been already exposed to. So briefly, could you tell us, Jim, what are the best practice for community engagement with regulator to advance on this matter from your perspective?
Thank you, Roger, and thank you, EATG, for asking me to join this conversation today and for everyone being here. I just want to call out the fact that I really focus on prevention, even though I'm living with HIV. Most of my work has been around prevention, so I am not the expert in this space. And there's a lot of experts on this panel and in the room. I want to call out a number of folks working in the United States who are doing incredible work in this space, including Linda D, Richard Jeffries, Jeff Taylor, Moises Augusto, Nelson Virgil, and Danielle Campbell. But in terms of best practices, I think there's a couple of things we could look at. And I'm going to put on my AVAC hat and point you to two things. For the last more than 10 years, maybe longer, AVAC has published with UNAIDS and has been putting forward a set of principles called the Good Participatory Practice for clinical trials. This is focused on prevention, but these lessons can be brought to people living with HIV and their involvement in clinical trials. And the GPP, or the Good Participatory Practice, sets out a whole number of guidelines for how to meaningfully engage communities who are impacted by HIV and how important that ongoing engagement is, which includes everything from before the protocol is written, when it's just a glimmer in a researcher's eye, all the way through follow-up, implementation, and monitoring. I also see one of my colleagues, Sindra Führer, on the line, and I want to call out something that she's been a part of. Recently, Sindra and colleagues working at AVAC and with allies around the world published a transgender manifesto. And the transgender manifesto really calls out the pretty deplorable lack of inclusion of transgender individuals and gender diverse individuals in clinical trials for HIV prevention. But it goes beyond just sort of calling them out. There's a scorecard that they can rate every single clinical trial. And then what they've been doing is beyond sort of calling it out and naming it, they've been going directly to clinical trial groups, as well as people, organizations in industry, so pharmaceutical companies, and having direct engagement and encouraging them to do better and sharing the manifesto, encouraging them to do better, and also putting them on, watch that we are going to be paying attention and that there are expectations for meaningful inclusion. So I think those are a couple of great examples. Nothing's going to happen with us sitting on the sidelines and complaining. Things like the Belong Project and the EATG position paper are so important to name things and galvanize folks, but it really takes ongoing engagement with every aspect of clinical trials, from the regulators to the drug makers to the folks who are implementing the studies. Thanks, Roger.
Thank you, Jim. A great point, and I think one of the challenges which makes it also different is that people are being put into boxes, and clinicians and researchers working on cancer are thinking cancer patient and not thinking about people living with HIV potentially having cancer. I don't know, from your personal experience, if you don't mind sharing, have you ever been approached to participate in a trial, or have you ever been considered? Have you ever considered contributing to a trial if you were aware of them? Because I think another issue is the awareness of a trial is being conducted that could be relevant to you. We know for prevention and cure, yes, it's obviously relevant, but when it's not, could you say a few words on that? Or
no, I have not, and I haven't, honestly, I don't know, pay a lot of attention to all the different studies that I potentially could be interested in, but I'll say, as someone living with HIV for a long time, I've had it now 28 years, I have other health conditions, right? That are, so HIV does not define my health, and my HIV is very well controlled. I've had an undetectable viral load for a very long time, very high T cells. So my HIV is really not a huge issue in terms of my health, but I have other conditions. I have asthma, I have allergies that can be severe. These things have almost taken me out a couple times in my life. I've gone into anaphylactic shock, ended up in the hospital. I've had serious pneumonia that had nothing to do with HIV. I have, I've had depression, bipolar, I have sleep apnea. So all kinds of other things really that, matter to my quality of life, to my longevity. And I would want to be included in any one of those things if I had the opportunity. I will just take this moment to highlight something that just happened a couple of weeks ago. And this is in the cancer space. And obviously, a lot of people with HIV are also dealing with various cancers and lymphomas. But from what I understand, there's a new study called AMC 112, which is being put forward by the AIDS Malignancy Consortium with the National Cancer Institute in the United States and Kite Pharma. And they're going to be conducting the first ever phase prospective study of CAR T to include patients with HIV. So this inclusion of people with HIV is still fairly nascent, but it's good to see that there are actual examples that we can point to.
actually, that was going to be my follow-up question. Are you aware of other example where there has been progress? You mentioned that cancer study, and COVID also spring to mind.
Yeah, if I could mention that, and the folks I mentioned earlier were all involved in the COVID a COVID win. So back in 2020, Moderna was doing big COVID vaccine study, utilizing the DAIDS infrastructure and clinical trial infrastructure, but they were excluding people living with HIV. And folks led by Linda D and others that I mentioned, rallied the troops, engaged Moderna directly, engaged folks at the National Institutes of Health. And on August 5th, 2020, Moderna changed its tack and no longer excluded people living with HIV from their COVID vaccine trials. And obviously this is critical. People with HIV are also susceptible to COVID, just like everybody else. And we may actually have worse outcomes when it comes to COVID. So excluding us from clinical trials was crazy and completely wrong. But it was changed, and it was changed from the dogged efforts of activists working with government and directly engaging industry to say this cannot stand. And there was a win there. So that was August 5, 2020, another win we can chalk up.
Great. I mean, yeah, you're right. Yeah, you have to battle for these kind of things. I'm going to move to Daniela. Just before that, just a reminder for audience, feel free to put question in the chat. I'll keep some minutes at the end of the panel and after to actually look at these questions. So I briefly touched about the benefits of part of having diversity in clinical research. Daniela, could you elaborate on the benefit of involving people living with HIV in clinical research in general, but more specifically when it affects, when it's about studies that affect their health, which are not related to HIV?
Hello, thanks for the invitation. I'm glad to be here. Well, I think that HIV has a long history of including patients living with HIV in the studies, and it's something that we should capitalize. I don't know if that's the word in English, for other pathologies and for other disciplines conducting clinical research. I think that we don't have to see participation only as something that is good for patients, but also for science. And sometimes we are doing our advocacy and our positioning is like people need to participate, but scientific do also need this diversity. They need to understand this that they are going to gain much more on reliable data, than we are going to have better uptake, etc. So I think that is something that that we need to present in a global way. And I don't know, I was thinking about one of the things that was discussing Jim about that you asked Roger about being asked to get into clinical trials. And for example, I do not live with HIV, but I had a very serious cancer. And I got into clinical trials only because of my background on HIV. So I was not, I had to ask for the information. Then I knew that there were this possibility, and then you get inside. And this is something that we as people living with HIV or in the field of HIV, we need to bring to people that are working with other pathologies, to make of them this culture of research.
Thank you. We often, we usually talk about community, like if it was a uniform mass of people, and the definition of communities keep being, discussed. Do you think there are different perceptions in the different constituencies of that community about about being excluded from trials? So I have to finish my question.
Yeah, I don't know if there is research about how communities live the fact of being excluded, which is already something to investigate. Is maybe we should do some research on how do you feel when you are not proposed or when you are excluded from a study. But I think that the very big issue here is the perceptions that eventually the doctors that are going to propose to get into a clinical study have on the communities. Because as you say, people living with HIV is not only about having a positive serology, it's about being gay, it's about taking drugs, it's about being a migrant. So it's also about behaviors. And I think that when we are choosing people to get into a clinical trial, we need people that are good candidates.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe it's not about HIV, it's about what are the behaviors that we think that people living with HIV might have, and then making of them bad candidates. Mm-hmm. So I don't know, I think that I will push a lot on this thing of taking both picture, the global picture, and seeing how we can train, how we can increase this literacy for people living with HIV to be more aware. This is something that we said in the manifesto, is that we need that all the people living with conditions push to be into the clinical trials, but we need to know that this is possible, what is a clinical trial, that my outcomes are compromised. And this is something that we need to work from the community and with healthcare and with researchers.
It's great because as you were speaking, the concept of research literacy came to my mind, and we often reserve it to community trial participants. But clearly there is maybe a need for improving the research literacy of the clinician and the researcher, and it should be a two-way learning. And I think Jim knows that, because that's what we've been doing for many years in HIV. You need to educate the people, and when you mean the people, it's not the community, it's everybody needs education. So if you wanted to say something on that, Jim, welcome.
I would just co-sign that strongly. I really appreciate Daniela's comments about the importance of including people with HIV for science and for science sake, beyond community. And, you know, being an HIV prevention research advocate for decades, and really focusing a lot of my work on rectal microbicides, so much of it has been about directly informing and educating and training and leading and pushing researchers and funders and lots of different powers who have blind spots or think they know everything and they don't. I think there's a lot of extraordinary expertise and wisdom in communities that is untapped, and that is that's a failure across all kinds of domains, and it's not good for science, it's not good for public health, and it's certainly not good for the populations who are being excluded or ignored or misrepresented or misunderstood because of blind spots, arrogance, or ignorance.
Great, which actually takes me directly to Chris. And it clearly, and if we want to change the situation, we're going to need to educate the inverted comma number of people. But the one who defines the guidelines that are normally followed are the regulator. Do we know what are the main regulatory or the barrier for including people living with HIV from non-HIV clinical trial? Or is it they didn't think about it? Or what do we know from, what's the regulator perspective on that, if we know?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, thanks for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here with you guys today. I think from a regulatory point of view, there's actually really no clear regulation that says people living with HIV cannot be in clinical trials. I think you've alluded in your intro to the main points that I was going to raise on that. I think the ICH E8 guideline, which is on considerations for clinical trials, mentions that line that you said, which is the clinical trial population should be those who would benefit from the product in the end. So that basically says you should include people with HIV if they're potentially going to use the product in the end. However, you get a few scientific technical aspects which may mean that that's not necessarily the best situation. For example, an early phase 1 PK study, maybe where you want a clean signal, and maybe where you have drug-drug interactions that you alluded to as well, because you've got antiretroviral, that may make the outcome of that study difficult to interpret or complicated. But once you get into efficacy and safety and you know that that's not an issue, there's really no need not to include patients with HIV. And I think in terms of guidelines, you mentioned the FDA being a bit more advanced as well, and that's clearly true from a couple of points of view. They have that guideline you also referred to with the clinical trials in cancer for HIV, hepatitis. In Europe, there's no clear mention of any guidelines or including any patients with HIV. And of course, we're talking about HIV here, but let's not forget other discrimination and other minority situations which are not represented in clinical trials. I mean, women were only included in trials since about the 90s, pretty much, which is ridiculous as well. And obviously, there's been a big problem or big concern in the US in the last couple of years, especially about African Americans, for example, are not represented enough in clinical trial populations. And they've also had to put guidelines out requiring people to do that. So I think there's a lot of change going on there, but really there's actually no foundation in the guidelines or regulation for not including people with HIV.
So as you noticed, different communities all affected by similar issues, but what would be your recommendation for community to successfully engage with the regulator or with the industry to make change happen? How do we go about doing that? We heard from Jim about Moderna and the COVID vaccine that it took a lot of effort, but are there things that we know work better?
Yeah, I think that advocacy always works quite well, and strong, consistent pressure there is always a good thing, because the regulators will listen, the medical journals will listen, and this is where some of the early debates will come. I mean, obviously, as citizens or non-regulators, we can't make guidelines, and this has come up in another project we have, which is doing a similar thing, but for advanced therapies. So we were explicitly told we cannot propose guidelines, we cannot propose regulations, but what you can do is literally what you've done: do a white paper, follow it up, just tried to discuss with the regulators directly, for example, innovation task force meetings with EMA. It can be a forum to propose guidelines with them. FDA also has some avenues where you can actually talk to them. For example, citizen petitions, I think they're called. You can try to talk to them and propose ways to make guidelines or include aspects in guidelines. But I think the key is consistency and keep moving. I mean, everyone knows these kind of issues can't win the fight with just one paper or one nice conversation. It's lots and lots of continuous work, and keep the issue in discussion all the time. And okay, people get sick of it maybe, but that's the way that we'll get the change done, is keep pressure on those people who need to make the regulations. Yeah.
Thank you. And I'm going back to Daniela and Jim on that question. What would you suggest doing to raise awareness based on your experience? Keep in mind, we are focusing on the European region, which works very differently. It's not a one state, even if it is, the European community plus a few other states. We have a fragmentation, and even if we have the European regulator, all of that has to work together. So we are in a bit of a different situation. I don't know if you would like to share some views on that.
Okay, I'll jump in first, and I think you're kind of comparing European Union to the United States, and I would say the United States has never been more fragmented than what it is. I mean, we may have some national authorities, but there's all kinds of, we have a range of states we have states who want to leave the union right now, and we have governors and legislators who are doing really incredibly horrible things throughout the country. So our people's access to care and treatment, gender affirming care in various places are being circumscribed. And of course, we've had terrible setbacks with regard to cisgender women's access to abortion and abortion related services, and really, really terrifying. We're in really terrifying times. So it's sort of, for me, someone from the United States to be giving advice to anyone else, it's like, we are not in a place, we should be getting lots of advice from others. But I will say that when you think about, fragmentation, part of this is being very specific. So you may have to have, while there is the European Union, you have all the different states in the union, you have to have efforts that are, tailored. Just like we do tailoring in terms of interventions for folks, we have to have our advocacy efforts and our messages and the people who are involved in those tailored for those situations. There may be different hurdles and different roadblocks or else different opportunities across those various countries. So that would be my main recommendation, is to think, while you're thinking about the European Union as a whole, you have to have specific strategies for each country, much like we now need to do in the fabulous United States of America.
Thank you. Daniela, and then I'll open the floor to the audience.
Yeah, when it comes to terms of advocacy, I think it's obvious that we have to do it at very different levels, and it's obvious that institutions must be addressed, and we have to push for guidelines, and we have to push for donors, for research agencies that will be more attentive to these issues. But since I am representing today community, and I will speak much more about mobilization of people who are living with HIV. I really believe in the fact that each and every one of them should have a minimal level of culture on this clinical trial. I mean, on their health, on what are their results, on what they can ask for to a doctor, on asking to the doctors, what is going on in research? Can you please tell me, what can I read? On the work that NGOs are doing at national level to provide information so clinical studies are more digest, so people can understand what is going on. And I think that if all the people living with HIV are more aware of this, and they are promoting this kind of discussion with their health providers is also a way of doing advocacy every day with every health providers. And I really believe on this mobilization and and way of doing empowerment and advocacy at the same time.
An everyday job. Thank you very much. I'm going to take some questions from the audience, and some people have already posted in the chat. And there was one which I think is interesting, because we talk about the regulator, the communities, and we also need to talk, I think, about the pharmaceutical industry. We have invited some people from the industry, and that question really for them, if there is someone willing to answer, please do come forward. And the question is an interesting one. Are there common resistance to the participation of people living with HIV, or are there examples of sponsors and companies that are more open to the inclusion? And I know from my experience working with industry that some industry have their own internal guidelines, which are quite open. So I'm just gonna open here the floor if there is someone from the industry on the call who would like to comment on their industry approach to it. Please do come and speak up and switch your camera on and just introduce yourself. I'm gonna give you 10 seconds to come forward, or otherwise I'll leave the question open. Don't be shy. That's okay. We'll leave the question open, but I'll ask it again at a later time. And another
So,
question
Roger,
was,
do you want me to throw in?
Yeah. Oh, Christopher. Yeah, sure.
Because I can't speak for all companies, of course, but I think some of the reluctance maybe comes back to what we mentioned before, or kind of mentioned before, about the guidelines. Because I think a lot of companies historically have been unwilling to take risks, let's say, with their clinical trial program, and they want to have the cleanest signal, the most outcome, and narrow the population to the point where it's not representative of the real world, but that's where they know they're going to get an efficacy reading that will get them the approval, that will get them the money, that will then, so I think there needs to be a bit of change to bring that, open that up a bit more and be more realistic about the study populations, I think, there. But as you mentioned, maybe some companies have policies for inclusion and openness, but they're reluctant to do so because there's a bottom line aspect to the efficacy readout in their pivotal clinical study or something like that that drives the decision making as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Another question was, since you mentioned study population, and in relation to the US guideline that says that CD4 count above 350 should make someone eligible. There was a question from the audience asking, well, is there a strong rationale for that? And I know we have Beatrice Mothé on the call, and that you are part of a study looking at that. If you want to comment on that, Beatrice.
Thanks first for the invitation. I think this is a great panel and so needed. Well, exactly. So it was a reflection of the situation that you were discussing before on the COVID vaccine development, that we just realized that all the vulnerables who had been excluded from the pivotal efficacy trials for all vaccine, basically. And as the pandemic was moving forward, that population, not only HIV, only people with HIV with advanced diseases, but also people having immunosuppressive therapies, cancer, and many situations, there was very limited data on that. And it was, as someone was saying in the chat, just relying on academic research. So we proposed to IPRA, which was on one of a pharma company that was developing an HIV vaccine, a protein-based vaccine, to specifically run a clinical trial with those kind of people living with immunosuppressive conditions. And in fact, that was a European funded project by the European Commission, and people here from EATG, Asphalion, is part of that in different work packages. And specifically, we are running this trial in people with HIV, with those CD4 cell counts, in people on dialysis, people after solid transplantation with 3 immunosuppressive agents, and people with primary autoimmune diseases with anti-CD20, treatments. So basically 5 groups of individuals with immunosuppressive conditions or treatments, and try to really understand the vaccine immune responses, the post-vaccination immune responses in those populations. Because I think Christopher was totally right that most sponsors are reluctant to include those individuals because of the fear of losing efficacy signals. But it's true that for many of those conditions, people with HIV with good CD4 T cells will respond as good as a person without HIV. So if we convince them for that first, those sponsors maybe will be more willing to include them. And if not, then propose them to have specific clinical trials with these populations to generate that information. And that also opens for sponsors and for pharma the possibility of getting those specific indications. Because if not, what we are handling, and all HIV care providers that are here will be with me, that we have all our patients coming and say, hey, I've been prescribed this medication, but it says there's no information in people with HIV. They don't know if that is going to be effective. They don't know if it has an interaction. They don't know if they need to modify. So we need to generate this data. So I think one way to convince the sponsors, which I think is the first bottleneck, that the protocols just they exclude them. So to include them, we need to convince them that for many of the situations, it will work as with people without HIV, and if not, then propose an alternative regimen, maybe additional doses or whatever. So it's super important to generate those. We are not talking about a minority disease. We are talking a status that affects so many people that it's super crucial for them to generate that information. So it's kind of twisting. So this is what we are doing in the RVD COP project, which is this one, and it's testing the IPRA booster vaccination in all these special populations. And we are recruiting around 400 individuals of these different conditions. So we are going to be able to generate that information. And specifically, as it is done in kind of academic environment, we're going to analyze deeply the immune responses, not only with the classical parameters, but with very in-depth analysis, also to understand which are the difficulties for each of the conditions to generate those responses and to be able to provide new information that can help also pharma.
Thank you. No, it's a very important point. And to go back to the protocol, it often looks like it's a copy-paste of just the same template being recycled without much thinking given to the population. Brian, you had your hand up.
Yeah, and it's Brian West here, the Chair of Partners in Science, EATG. A couple of points here, just in relation to the last point made by Beatrice. One of the reasons why we actually came forward with this project was because of the exclusion of people from COVID-19 vaccine trials in Italy. And we made the comment at the time to the Italian regulators that it was not very helpful excluding people from these clinical trials, given that it was quite obvious that people living with HIV were going to be the target group of people who would be highlighted as people who would be the first to get these very vaccines. However, following on from that, we had a big discussion with Sanofi, and this goes back to the question that you asked about the companies and inclusion in clinical trials. Sanofi were quite open and if you like, quite friendly with us, and they actually were quite happy to admit that it is a conservatism with a small c. People wanting to get clean data, people not wanting anything to actually slow down the process which brings the drug to market. But we also discussed another really important point there, that actual conservatism in slowing and speeding up the drug coming to the market doesn't help once it's reached the market. In Europe, getting any medicine or vaccine or anything approved is just the beginning. It then has to go through health technology assessments. And if we don't have data for the health technology assessment to say, this is actually a product that is applicable amongst a lot of people, not just a very narrow band of people, then the actual effort you put into speeding up the EMA acceptance process is lost by the the slowing down of the HTA process. So I think there's room for us there to make that point and to go forward with the pharmaceutical companies into saying it isn't all about getting the drug approved. It's about getting the drug used, and you need data on the groups of people it's going to be used in, which is far wider than the ones that have been used in the clinical trials.
Thank you, Brian. Great point too, and great discussion. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. We could probably talk much longer. Before handing back to Rocco for the final part, I just would like to give 10 seconds to Daniela, Christopher, and Jim. Tell us what's best to do to move this forward. One sentence. Let's start with Daniela.
2 sentences. No, 2 ideas, please, very quickly.
That's fine.
I think that we as activists, we need to do a follow-up on which people living with HIV is getting into clinical trials. So to be sure that trans people, migrants, Black people, drug users, women are included, and not putting everything on the package of people living with HIV. So there are not only white men in good health. And I would like to finish on remembering that research is political, data is political. So just to have this idea on mind every time that we are doing something about clinical trials. That's all.
Thank you. Christopher?
I'm just trying to think of one sentence. I was going to say diversity as well, and I think Daniela picked me up already on that. But I think one of the things that we sometimes see from our regulatory point of view as well is differences not only within a population, but between countries and between times even. So I think if we're looking for diversity, let's embrace it and just get more diverse, if you know what I mean, because I think that's really the answer. And I think that comes also as well from something Jim said about who is making sometimes these decisions. My feeling might be a lot of medical people, you know, might be used to working with people living with HIV, but some other people might not. So therefore, they're not considering those communities. So maybe reaching them and breaking that barrier to actually making them think that there's not a separate community, let's say, but they're part of the same community that they're already part of. And that is what I mean by expanding the diversity. So that actually includes everything and everyone within the scientific technical limits of what we're doing. So I think that for me would be what would be something to go for. Yeah.
Thank you. Jim?
Thanks, and thanks all for such a great conversation. This has been amazing. So I'm going to say a few quick phrases, not sentences. So silence equals death and continues to equal death. Diversity is our strength. This is not a sprint, it is a marathon, perhaps an ultra marathon. So persistence, 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 persistence.
Great words. Rocco, over to you. Thank you to the panelists.
Thank you, Roger, and once again, many thanks to all our guest speakers for this great discussion. I'm Rocco Pignata, and I'm a project coordinator at the EATG. I will try to be super brief because we do not have much time left, but I will try to give you an overview of our Belong project. So next slide, please. I guess it is by now clear how we started. We moved from our position paper and we developed a whole project, Belong, whose ultimate goal is to advocate for regulatory authorities in Europe to adopt clinical guidelines that include people living with HIV in trials relating to other health conditions that affect people living with HIV. Next slide, please. This project will be developed into phases. We are currently in phase 1, which will last until the end of 2023. And with this phase, we aim to complete all the research and groundwork for the creation of the guidelines. And I will share more details on the activities in a moment. So next slide, please. So who will we be collaborating with? With Belong, we will try to bring together different stakeholders, including people living with HIV, different patient organizations, clinical societies, regulatory agencies, and industry partners, and collaborate with communities from other disease areas. And with Belong, we will hopefully benefit the HIV community and the community of patients at large, and will give specific attention to the inclusion of underrepresented communities in research and development, such as cisgender women and transgender people. And this whole project will be implemented with our community advisory group of 7 EATG members, and we will ensure the centrality of community in each of the tasks we will be doing. So next slide, please. Here you can see a visual representation of the activities that are expected for phase 1, which will cover 2023. So strategies will be developed, then through a mapping exercise and an outreach of to relevant stakeholders, partnerships will be identified and solidified. But with Belong, we also aim to reflect on community needs and the lessons learned from an example of EATG post successful community advocacy. So we will build a case study based on a series of previous EATG meetings, which took place in Sitges in Spain between 2007 and 2017. And resulted in a successful stakeholder collaboration and approval of a set of guidelines to include people living with HIV and HCV co-infections in essential HCV drug treatment trials. And by documenting this meeting, EATG will reflect on the lessons learned, create a plan to replicate the same model of meeting and apply it to Belong to achieve its objectives. So next slide, please. And here you can have like an overview of our phase 2. Nothing is set in stone because, as I was saying, it will depend on the lessons learned from phase 1, and also it will depend on further funding. But this is more or less an overview of the next activities that we envision for phase 2. So we hope that recommended guidelines will be drafted. Then a consultation and consensus building process based on the Sitges model will follow, where multi-stakeholder meetings will be held to agree and consolidate the guidelines, to include people living with HIV in trials relating to other health conditions that affect people living with HIV. So through this experience, we hope to produce and disseminate resources that could be used for community capacity building and engagement. So next slide. And with this, my presentation ends, and I do not think we have much time left. So for any questions on the project, just feel free to drop me a line or more at rocco.pignata@eatg.org. So just a quick heads up before we close. At the end of the meeting, you will see a brief survey to gather your feedback on this event. It is very important for us, so please, it would be very much appreciated if you could dedicate just a bit more of your time and fill it. To wrap up, I just wanted to thank Roger for his great contribution and our amazing guest speakers. So a virtual round of applause to Jim, Daniela, and Chris. And a big thank you to all my EATG colleagues who have contributed to this event: Fiona, Giorgio, Chiara, Apostolo, Stephanie, and of course, thank you all for joining us today and for being part of this roundtable discussion. And with this, I wish you all a lovely day.